I'm Jason Stipp from Morningstar. As we head into the fourth quarter, concerns about the so-called fiscal cliff coming up at the end of the year and the beginning of 2013 are intensifying. But what exactly is this fiscal cliff? What's the potential impact? And what are some likely scenarios? Here to offer some very important context around the fiscal cliff is Morningstar's Bob Johnson, our Director of Economic Analysis. Bob, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
This is a very important topic. We've been hearing a lot from readers about it. We see a lot in the press about it. The fiscal cliff. We hear about it, but what exactly is the cliff? What comprises that big potential drop-off that we could see at the beginning of 2013?
It's a fairly large number of items that are happening with the tax code and various spending programs that it's scheduled to take effect the first of the year. And they're very big numbers. I mean, we're talking about $719 billion or so on a calendarized basis for these numbers. That's a large number relative to GDP. It's about 5%. So it is a huge number.
So this fiscal cliff was part of an agreement made earlier that these automatic cuts would essentially take place at the beginning of 2013 if some action isn't taken. So what are some of those things? I mean, it's a combination of things with the tax code and
let me walk through those. The biggest one is the Bush tax cuts are scheduled to expire. And we recall that they were supposed to expire early in Obama's term, and we extended them so that they wouldn't ruin the economy. And so those are scheduled to expire at the end of 2012, and that's the biggest bucket of the number. That's over a third of the number is the Bush tax cuts. Another thing that's in there every year, it's a little game. There's this thing with the alternative minimum tax that's calculated, and that's also a very big number. Kind of maybe somewhere in the 10 to 20% range of this problem
of the total cliff.
Of the total cliff. So that's certainly another big thing that's there. Now, the other big category of things, so that's things related to the tax cut, and those are probably the biggest piece of them. Then the other big cut is the sequestration. Now, recall what that came about is when we were arguing about the deficit last August, when we were talking about the debt ceiling and so forth. They said, fine, if we can't agree by the end of 2012, then we're going to make these automatic cuts, and we're going to cut defense spending, and we're going to cut other programs, each about 10%, and it's going to be automatic. And the Republicans will obviously be mad because it cuts defense spending, and the Democrats will be mad because of what it does to social spending. So you guys are never going to really let this happen.
So the cliff is really a combination of getting more revenue in by letting some tax cuts expire and then also cutting spending in the government. And some of those are pretty drastic numbers, as you said. So if this is amounting to 4.6 to 5% of GDP, if all of these cuts happen, what is the effect then on the GDP growth rate that we see? You wouldn't just subtract that, right? I mean, if these all happen, what is it projected will happen to the GDP growth?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a big staff of economists to crank those through for me, but the Congressional Budget Office has run through that exercise. And they said that if we have this fiscal cliff and all these things happen, GDP growth, instead of being somewhere in the 2 to 3% range, will end up being a negative 0.5%. And obviously in one quarter, we'll have a very negative looking number for GDP growth. But for the full year, 2013, it'll be a 0.5% off of GDP.
So there's some pretty broad agreement then that we would be pushed into negative growth recession type of effect if the cliff happens in its entirety.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I think that there are several very big cuts here to spending and several things that I think a lot of folks from all different corners would agree are very drastic and probably they don't want to happen. And I think this was put in place to kind of stir action in Congress to take care of some of these issues. You think that there are some things that are very likely to happen and some things that if we can get some heads together, there's certainly motivation to keep them from happening. What is a possible likely scenario for a smaller cliff that we might see?
There's a few things that I think will happen. I think the payroll tax cut, I mean, get ready for this. I mean, in January 1st, we've all been getting a 2% savings on our Social Security payroll taxes, and those will go away. There's kind of broad-based partisan support to get rid of that. So that's gone.
And that was part of a stimulus measure during the recovery, so that people would have a little bit more money to spend.
Correct.
Okay.
I think the unemployment being up at 99 weeks, I think that program's about getting shut down, and that will definitely happen. That's not a very big number. and also kind of a similar size, the Obamacare taxes. The taxes, when the new health plan gets implemented in January, there'll be a new tax on investment income, and it'll be some of the other taxes will now be relevant to all income, not just in earned income. So that will also add something in the $25 to $30 billion range to taxes, and that will happen. I mean, unless we shut down all of Obamacare before the first of the year, which ain't going to happen, that's going to get done. So you total those three, and if I told you the total of everything we drove off the cliff was $700 billion, over $700 billion, we're about at $170 billion if those three things happen, and that they're not insignificant.
And again, you said there's some broad agreement that some of these measures will probably go ahead and happen or are likely to happen. So if that's kind of a likely scenario and we reach some agreements that stave off some of these big drastic budget cuts on defense and the others, you said that number is about 1% of GDP when you total it up. What would the effect of that be on GDP growth? So if the 5% of GDP from the whole cliff is going to push us to negative 0.5 GDP for the year, what would this smaller cliff mean for the economy?
The Congressional Budget Office, again, in their scenario, has it about 1.7%, and without it, it'd be well over 2%. So it's much less of a drastic effect. Also, let me put that $170 billion of likely cuts and tax increases into perspective. The budget deficit this year was reduced by about $200 billion. So I'm talking about 170 this year. So it's kind of what we lived through this year, which wasn't pleasant. We saw it. We saw a lot of government numbers looking not so good this year, and a lot of income numbers not looking as nice as I'd like them to look. And so I think it's going to be one more year where the impact's about the same as it was last year.
So we've been feeling that headwind already because they have been working to cut the deficit, is basically what you're saying. So it could be a continuation of feeling that headwind into 2013.
Well, one could charitably say that, but what happened is actually the stimulus spending, which was a three-year program, came to an end, and so and also we got a little bit better economy and some capital gains income coming in. So we had a $200 billion reduction last year and still had GDP growth of what's going to probably come out close to 2%. So it's kind of, I'm not making this up when I say, oh, gee, reducing the deficit by $170 billion is we're still going to have economic growth. Well, we did this year.
So we've already seen that. And you also mentioned that there are countervailing forces that might happen if we see some cuts and we get some certainty around what the policy is going to be that would keep GDP, maybe it would lessen the headwind a little bit, the certainty might be able to add to some kind of going forward with the economy. What do you think some of those forces are? So if we get this smaller fiscal cliff and we see some certainty about what's going to happen, that could actually give the market some certainty there, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of interactions in all of the variables. And I think the key thing people have to understand, even if we have the 5%, the full range of fiscal cliff, everybody's trying to make it like 5% of GDP is going to disappear. It doesn't happen that way because people dip into their savings instead of cutting their spending, especially the wealthy. The wealthy spend a very, very, very small percentage of their assets every year and their incomes. And so that they've got a range of possibilities. And then if we have a slower economy, it means less inflation, which affects another set of numbers. And as you mentioned, this whole psychology thing, well, gee, I was a little bit suffering now, but now I know the deficit's going to be a little bit better. That can help the economy. Now I know what it is. What I can't live with is knowing if I'm going to get the 5% cut or if I'm going to get the 1% cut or if I'm going to get no change. And that's what everybody's having such a hard time planning right now. So as you mentioned, part of the reason the impact isn't so bad is because people are already starting to plan for it right now.
All right, Bob. Well, it's almost impossible to forecast exactly what Congress will do by the end of the year, at the beginning of the next year. But it's very good to have this context and understand exactly what the numbers we're talking about and the possible effect. Thanks for offering that today.
Thank you.
From Morningstar, I'm Jason Stipp. Thanks for watching.